Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The old chapel at the edge of Maple Hollow stood still in the amber glow of late afternoon. Its white paint had faded into soft cream over the years, the wooden steps slightly bowed by decades of Sunday shoes and whispered prayers. Today, it was dressed for celebration. Garlands of wildflowers twisted along the railings, pews dusted and adorned, a modest arch of eucalyptus branches awaiting its moment. But the air was too still, not hushed with anticipation, but with something heavier, like a melody that never found its final note. She sat at the top of the steps, motionless. Amelia Hart was not the kind of woman one forgot. Even now, in a wedding dress that hung delicately over her frame, she looked composed, except for her hands. They trembled as they clutched the stems of a wilting bouquet. Her veil had slid askew, catching in the spokes of the wheelchair she hadn't meant to bring. Her eyes were not red, not yet, just vacant, as if all the color of this day had drained from her world. No one else was around. No guests, no music, no frantic bridesmaids fluttering to fix lipstick or lace. Just the wind playing gently with her skirt, and the heavy silence of a ceremony that would never begin. Down the road, the crunch of tires against gravel echoed faintly. A pickup truck slowed near the chapel, its faded blue paint chipping at the edges. Behind the wheel was Caleb Morgan, one hand steady as always, the other adjusting the rearview mirror. In the back seat, his 8-year-old son Miles had drifted off, clutching a sketchbook and a stuffed fox with warm button eyes. They hadn't meant to come this way. Caleb was on his way to drop off a donation at the community pantry, a weekly routine that helped him feel tethered. Life since Lizzie's passing had become a quiet series of checklists and detours. Most days, he welcomed the silence. But today, for reasons he couldn't explain, he'd turned right instead of left at the crossroads and taken a long way. "Daddy," Miles stirred, peeking through lashes. Miles pointed, his voice still thick with sleep. "There's a lady at the church, in a wedding dress." Caleb squinted, following his son's gaze. He saw her then, a figure draped in white, stark against the weathered wood of the church. Something in his chest tightened. She looked sad. Caleb pulled over without thinking. They stepped out quietly. Miles walked slightly ahead, his sneakers kicking up dust. Caleb stayed back, unsure if he should approach, unsure of anything except that leaving felt impossible. Amelia didn't look up. "Hi," Miles said gently. No preamble, no fear. She blinked, slowly lifting her gaze. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "Hello, are you okay?" Her lips parted as if to form a lie. A nod, a yes, some version of "I'm fine." But the words never came. Instead, her shoulders sank. "I was supposed to get married today," she said, not quite to them, maybe not even to herself. But he left. Miles looked back at Caleb, confused. Caleb stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it more than he expected. Amelia met his eyes for the first time, and then something unspoken passed between them. Recognition not of faces, but of ache, of people who had once imagined a different life than the one they held now. "Do you need anything?" Caleb asked. Amelia shook her head. "Just time." "Well," Miles said brightly, as only a child could, "we brought snacks." That was how it began, not with declarations or sweeping gestures, but with a boy offering peanut butter crackers to a woman in a wedding dress. They sat on the church steps for nearly an hour. Amelia didn't say much. Neither did Caleb. But silence, when shared with kindness, is a kind of music. Miles told stories about school, about his fox, about how he once tried to build a rocket from juice boxes. Eventually, Caleb offered to drive her somewhere. She hesitated, but the ache in her spine overruled pride. He folded the wheelchair into the truck bed as carefully as if it were glass. Miles helped her settle into the front seat, whispering, "You can sit by the window. It's the best view." They didn't ask her name until later. She didn't ask why they stopped. But as the truck rolled away from the chapel, Amelia looked back once. Not in longing, not in sorrow, but in quiet acknowledgement of a story that ended before it began. Ahead, the road curved into the trees, golden light spilling across the pavement. And somewhere in the slow rhythm of tires turning, of breath steadying, and of hearts remembering how to hope, something new began to bloom. Not love, not yet, but the space where it might live. And that, in its own way, was a beginning. The name he never forgot. Caleb Morgan stood frozen on the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun glinting off the church steeple behind him. He hadn't meant to stop. It was supposed to be a brief detour before checking into the inn, a stroll down memory lane in town he hadn't seen in nearly a decade. But there she was, Amelia. Not the Amelia he remembered bounding barefoot through summer fields, but a woman in a wedding dress, alone, wilted bouquet in her lap, her wheelchair positioned squarely in the shadow of the chapel where her life was supposed to begin. He hadn't heard that name aloud in years, but it rose in his chest now like a tide that refused to stay buried. His son Miles tugged gently on his hand. "Dad, do you know her?" Caleb swallowed hard, the name nearly catching in his throat. He hadn't expected to see her again, much less like this. There had been no calls, no letters, no explanations, only silence that had stretched into years. "Her name is Amelia," he said softly. Miles' eyes widened. "Like the one in the old picture in your drawer?" Caleb nodded slowly, as if his body had to remember how to move. He took a tentative step forward, watching as Amelia turned her head, her eyes dull with something more than tears. When their eyes met, there was no cinematic gasp, no scripted drama, only a long, loaded pause. She blinked. Recognition flickered. And then, as if her heart had caught up to her gaze, she whispered, "Caleb." He crouched beside her, mindful of the dress, the chair, the storm in her eyes. "Amelia, I didn't know." She laughed then, short and bitter. "Neither did I. Not really. I thought maybe this time, maybe this would be different." Caleb felt the old ache stir inside him. She had always been the one with dreams that lit up the room and doubts that lingered behind her smile. Back then, he had loved her through both. And when she vanished after the accident, he mourned her like a death that never got a funeral. He sat beside her on the steps, the silence folding around them like an old coat. "I never forgot you," he said finally. Amelia turned toward him. "You should have. I made sure of it." Caleb shook his head. "You disappeared, Amelia. One day we were planning a life together. The next, you were gone. No note, no call. Just gone." She looked down at her hands, the bouquet wilting between her fingers. "I didn't want you to see me like this." "Like what?" "Like someone broken. Someone who can't walk down the aisle, can't dance in the kitchen, can't hike the trails we used to love." Caleb's voice softened. "You think love is measured by motion?" Amelia shook her head, biting her lip until it turned pale. "I thought you deserved more." Miles, sensing something unspoken between them, stepped closer. He handed Amelia a small leaf he'd picked from a church courtyard. "My dad says when something breaks, it can grow again. Like this tree. It got struck by lightning, but it still blooms." Amelia blinked back tears. She took the leaf gently, as if afraid it might shatter. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb stood and offered her his hand. "Let us take you somewhere." "Anywhere but here." She hesitated, then nodded. That night, in a quiet room at Willow Glen Inn, Amelia sat at the window, watching dusk settle over the hills. The dress hung on the back of a chair, no longer luminous, but still hers. Miles was asleep on the couch, and Caleb had just returned with tea. "You didn't have to come back for me," she said softly. "You didn't have to leave without saying goodbye," he replied, not unkindly. She looked at him, then really looked. And for the first time in years, Caleb saw her, not the girl she once was, but the woman she had become. "I'm tired of disappearing," she whispered. "Then stay," Caleb said. "Just for now. Just long enough to remember how to begin again." And in the stillness of that room, with night falling soft and unhurried, Amelia Hart didn't promise a future. But she didn't run either. Sometimes that's all a miracle needs to begin. The boy with a brave heart. It began with crayons. Miles Morgan had a habit of carrying a small box of them in his backpack everywhere he went. He said you never knew when the world needed more color. That morning, while Amelia sat quietly by the window in the spare room Caleb had offered her for a few nights, Miles appeared beside her with paper, crayons, and an earnest expression that only 8-year-olds could wear with such conviction. "Do you want to draw with me?" he asked, holding out a crumpled sheet. Amelia hesitated. Her fingers still trembled slightly from yesterday. From a shock. From seeing Caleb again. From realizing that the man who had once looked at her like the sun had returned in her life by the soft whisper of his son's heart. But Miles was persistent. Not in a loud, demanding way, but in that gentle, anchored manner of someone who believed every invitation was sacred. "Sure," she said, voice low. They sat together on the floor, crayons scattered like fallen leaves. Amelia drew a willow tree without realizing. Miles drew a duck wearing sneakers. They laughed, softly but genuinely. Then he asked, as he shaded in the blue sky above his duck, "Do you know what I think you are?" Amelia tilted her head. "What's that?" "A person who walks with her heart." She blinked. Miles didn't look up from his paper. "My mom used to say that to me, that some people walk with their legs and some people walk with their hearts. She said those ones leave light behind them, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. I think you're like that." Amelia didn't know what to say. No adult had ever told her something so whole. And here was a boy, no taller than her wheels, offering her a truth wrapped in crayon wisdom. She looked down at his drawing. A stick-figure family, a man, a boy, and a woman in a wheelchair under a bright sun. All three figures were smiling. "Is that your family?" she asked, her voice catching. Miles nodded. "It's mine, and I thought maybe it could be yours too if you want." Her breath hitched. That night, Caleb found the picture pinned gently to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a duck. He stood quietly, one hand resting on the kitchen counter, staring at it longer than necessary. "He likes her," he said aloud. Amelia, behind him, smiled gently. "I like him too." They stood there, not touching, not moving, just two people suddenly aware of a warmth growing not from romance, but from something simpler, something quieter. The kind of love that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but simply stays. Over the next few days, Miles found reasons to pull Amelia into little moments of life. He asked her to taste test his pancake toppings, peanut butter and pickles included. He asked her to read him stories and then insisted she do the voices. She gave the dragon a French accent and the knight a southern drawl. Miles declared her a professional actress. In those moments, Amelia felt her spine stretch taller, not from healing, but from belonging. Caleb watched it all with quiet awe. He didn't try to name what was happening. He didn't press. He just set the table with 3 plates instead of 2 and left a blanket across the back of Amelia's chair when the evenings got cold. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Miles dragged his beanbag to the center of the living room and set it beside her wheelchair. "Want to know a secret?" he whispered. Amelia leaned in, matching his whisper. "Always. I think families don't have to match. They just have to choose each other." Amelia stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached over and took his hand. "Thank you," she said, eyes shimmering. "That's the best secret I've ever heard." He beamed. Later that night, as the rain drummed gently against the roof, Caleb sat across from Amelia, with 2 mugs of tea between them. "You know," he said, "he's never called anyone family before. Not like that." Amelia looked down at her cup. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't even know who I am anymore." Caleb reached across the table, not to hold her hand, but to steady her heart. "I think," he said gently, "you're someone who's starting to remember that broken doesn't mean unloved, and empty doesn't mean done." She swallowed hard. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. "It's not about being whole," he added. "It's about being real. And Miles, he sees real. That's his superpower." In the soft quiet that followed, Amelia felt it. Not love. Not yet. But the small, steady beat of being seen. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like a story that ended. She felt like one that had just begun, dancing without feet. The garden behind the Morgan house had always been a quiet patch of land, overgrown in some corners, a bit uneven in others, with wildflowers that bloomed wherever they pleased. But to Amelia Hart, it felt sacred. It wasn't the grand stages she once knew, or the polished floors of the studio where she used to guide young dancers through plies and pirouettes. But it was here, beneath the swaying branches of an old elm, where something lost inside her had begun to stir. Miles was already waiting that afternoon, barefoot in the grass, a crooked smile on his face and a notebook clutched in his hands. He'd taken to calling their time together movement lessons, though he insisted it wasn't about dancing. "It's about telling stories without talking," he explained. Amelia had smiled at that. The boy had a way of distilling the truth into something simple and beautiful. She wheeled herself over the uneven stones, the wheels of her chair catching once on a root, then gliding freely into the open patch they had come to call their dance floor. The sun filtered through the trees, golden and soft, painting shadows on the earth like brush strokes. "Ready?" she asked. Miles nodded. "Ready." She raised her arms, slow and steady. "Let's start with breath. Just breathe with me." He closed his eyes. "Inhale. Exhale." They sat like that for a moment, the stillness alive with something unspoken. Amelia didn't instruct him where to put his feet or how to position his arms. Instead, she whispered, "Let the wind move your fingertips." And so they moved. It was unchoreographed, imperfect, glorious. Miles twirled gently, his arms mimicking hers, his small body responding to rhythm only he could hear. Amelia's arms traced patterns in the air, slow curves and soft spirals, memories of muscle memory layered with new meaning. She couldn't rise to dance, but she could guide. She could feel. As they moved, she saw flashes of her old self. Not the woman who had been left at the chapel, or the patient learning to live in a wheelchair, but the teacher who once believed dance was a way to breathe life into silence. "Is this how you used to teach?" Miles asked, pausing mid-spin, cheeks flushed. Amelia smiled. "In a way, I used to talk more, worry more about form. Why don't you now?" She looked at him carefully. "Because form is only one part of the story. And now, I know the heart is the part people feel the most." Miles sat beside her in the grass, picking a dandelion and blowing it toward the sky. "Do you miss it?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "But I don't miss the mirrors or the pressure. I miss the connection, the moment someone realizes they can move in a way they didn't think they could. That's the magic." The boy looked thoughtful. "Then maybe this is better, because I didn't think I could dance. But now I do." She looked at him, truly looked, and something cracked open gently inside her. It wasn't grief. Not anymore. It was wonder. Wonder that in the ashes of what she'd lost, something new was growing. Later that evening, after dinner and dishes and the quiet lull of bedtime stories, Caleb found Amelia still sitting by the open window, her sketch pad open on her lap. He watched as she traced a loose swirl with her pencil, a movement he recognized from earlier. "You're still working?" he asked, stepping inside. "Not working. Remembering," she said, glancing up. He nodded toward the pad. "What are you drawing?" "Choreography," she said softly. "But not for a stage. For a garden. For a boy with a brave heart." Caleb sat down across from her, silence stretching comfortably between them. He didn't ask questions, didn't press. He had learned that the best kind of support wasn't always in words, but in presence. Finally, she looked at him. "I used to think dancing was about perfection, about beauty in the way a body moved. Now, I think it's about trying again, even when the music changes." He reached across the table, touching her hand lightly. "And you, Amelia Hart, are one of the bravest dancers I've ever seen." She blinked, her lips parting, a soft breath escaping. "Thank you," she said. Then after a pause, "I'm thinking of teaching again. Not like before, just for whoever wants to learn. Maybe at the community center. Maybe in this backyard." "I think you'd be incredible," he said. She smiled. "I don't know if I'll be incredible, but I'll be honest. And maybe that's enough." Outside, the moon rose quietly over the town, its light casting silver outlines on the garden below. From a window, they could just see the outline of the elm tree, its branches swaying like arms in mid-dance. In the hush of that moment, Amelia closed her eyes, letting the memory of movement wash over her. Not with pain, but with possibility. She didn't have to dance the way she used to. She just had to keep moving. And this time, she wasn't moving alone. A quiet table, a loud heart. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle by the time Amelia wheeled herself up the ramp to the Willow Creek Inn. The lights glowed from within like something out of a dream she used to have back when she imagined honeymoons and shared breakfasts. Now, the thought of walking, or rather wheeling, into a place that might hold warmth instead of silence made her chest ache. Caleb stood at the door, holding it open for her. No tuxedo, no pretense, just a soft flannel shirt and hands that looked like they knew both labor and gentleness. "We don't do fancy," he said with a half smile. "Good," Amelia replied. "I'm fresh out of fancy." Inside, the inn's dining room was nearly empty, save for a fireplace flickering in the corner and a couple of elderly women playing dominoes at a far table. Miles sat at a small table set for three, kicking his feet under the bench, a proud grin on his face. "Reserved seating," he announced as she approached. "For VIPs only." Amelia laughed, and it surprised her how easily it came. She was beginning to learn that Miles had that effect on people. On her. She slid into the space beside the table and removed her rain-damp shawl. The table was set with chipped ceramic plates, mismatched silverware, and glasses of water that sparkled in the firelight. "I hope you like stew," Caleb said, setting a steaming bowl in front of her. "Stew is perfect," she replied, inhaling the scent. "It smells like November." Caleb chuckled and took his seat. "That's because it's my mom's recipe." She called it the soup of showing up. "Why?" "Because it only tastes right when you make it for someone who needs comfort." There was a stillness that settled over the table then, not awkward but sacred. Like all three of them knew, they were part of something delicate and new. They ate slowly. Amelia asked Miles about his drawings. He told her about the ducks he named at the pond, about his goal of becoming a paleontologist who also bakes cookies. Caleb listened, smiled, occasionally added in a dry quip that made Amelia laugh into her spoon. At one point, Caleb excused himself to refill their drinks. Alone with Miles, Amelia found herself watching the boy draw circles in his water glass with his finger. "Did your mom like to dance too?" she asked gently. Miles nodded. "She used to spin me in the kitchen. But I was little. I barely remember." Amelia placed her hand over his gently. "She sounded wonderful." Miles looked up at her. "You remind me of her. Not because you look the same, but because of how I feel when I'm near you." Her throat tightened. Before she could respond, Caleb returned, placing a cup of cocoa in front of her. "Did Miles tell you he insists on dessert before dishes?" he said with mock accusation. "It's the only rule that matters," Miles chimed in. They laughed, and for a few brief moments, it felt like they had done this 100 times before. Like they were remembering rather than building something. Later, as they finished their drinks and the fire dwindled into embers, Caleb leaned back in his chair. "It's funny," he said quietly. "I've sat at this table alone more times than I can count. Tonight, I didn't want the evening to end." Amelia looked down at her empty cup, the warmth lingering in her palms. "Neither did I." Miles yawned, his body folding naturally into Amelia's side like he had always done it. "Can we do this again?" he murmured. She brushed a hand through his hair, her voice softer than breath. "I like that very much." Caleb stood, lifting Miles into his arms. The boy didn't stir. "I'll walk you out," he said. They stood in the lobby for a moment longer. Caleb hesitated, then said, "Thank you for saying yes. To dinner. To being here." Amelia smiled, not the small, polite kind, but one that touched the sadness behind her eyes and cradled it with care. It didn't feel like dinner. It felt like home. She turned to leave, her wheels quiet on the wooden floor. Caleb watched her go, heart loud in the silence. And somewhere in the flicker of that fading firelight, something unnamed began to take root. Not love, not yet, but a beginning that felt like it belonged. The fall that almost broke her. The early September sun filtered through gauzy curtains and danced on the hardwood floor, casting golden streaks across the room. It was meant to be a good day, a day of progress, a day when Amelia Hart would take a few more steps than yesterday. Just a few. Just enough to prove to herself that hope still lived somewhere inside her bones. But hope can be fragile, like a porcelain cup balanced on a windowsill. One gust of wind, one misstep, and the whole thing shatters. She'd been walking in the garden that morning. Caleb had built a makeshift walking path beside the fence line, lined with smooth stones and dotted with little flags that Miles had decorated with crayon hearts and stick-figure dancers. Amelia smiled at the memory of it now. How proud Miles had been to declare it Mom's Dance Trail. She had made it halfway down that trail before the cane slipped. She didn't cry out. She didn't scream. Her body twisted as it fell, landing hard on the cold earth. Pain bloomed through her ribs and hip. But it wasn't the pain that broke her. It was the sound of Miles calling her name, frantic, panicked. It was the look in Caleb's eyes when he rushed to her. Guilt and helplessness mixed in equal measure. "I'm fine," she'd said, forcing the words out between gritted teeth. But she wasn't. Not really. For 3 days, Amelia didn't leave the guest bedroom. She didn't open the curtains. She didn't answer when Miles slipped drawings under her door or when Caleb knocked softly and asked if she wanted some tea. She lay in bed, the ache in her body less sharp than the one inside her. The fall had pulled her back into a place she thought she'd already climbed out of, a place where every hope felt dangerous and every act of courage felt like a setup for disappointment. "I thought I was past this," she whispered to the empty room on the second night. "I thought I was stronger." Shame curled around her like a second skin. The old voices came back, quiet, cruel ones that told her she was a burden, a disappointment, that love would always leave when it got too hard. She believed them once, and part of her feared they were right again. On the fourth night, there was a soft knock on her door. She didn't answer, but the door opened anyway. "I brought something," Caleb said, gently. She didn't look at him, just stared at the ceiling. "I'm not in the mood." "I know. That's why I'm here." He crossed the room, sat in the old armchair near her bed, and placed a small stack of yellowing envelopes in his lap. He took a breath and began reading. "Dear Amelia, it's been 7 months since I last saw you. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it anyway. Because today I thought I saw you on a street corner and it knocked the air right out of me. I realized I still miss you, and I probably always will." Amelia blinked. Her breath caught. Caleb continued. His voice was steady, but quiet, like reading a bedtime story he knew by heart. "I wrote you every year. I never mailed them. Didn't even know where to send them. But I wrote them because love doesn't really know how to shut up, does it?" He read through 3 more letters, each one raw, full of grief, wonder, longing. Letters that spoke of dreams lost and memories treasured, of the ways she had shaped him even in her absence. When he finished, he looked up. "I kept writing because I needed you to know that even when I didn't understand why you left, I never stopped loving the part of you that believed I deserved more. But you were wrong, Amelia. I didn't want more. I wanted you." Tears spilled silently down her cheeks. Her body ached, her pride burned, but something inside her cracked open, a soft place she hadn't touched in years. "You shouldn't have to stay for someone like me," she whispered. Caleb stood, walked to her bedside, and sat on the edge of the mattress. "I'm not staying because I have to," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm staying because you are someone I choose. Not for your strength, not for your courage, though I see both. I choose you even in your weakness, especially in your weakness." She turned her head, looked at him fully. "You're not disappointed?" He shook his head slowly. "I'm heartbroken for you, but never disappointed. And I'm not going anywhere." Amelia didn't reply. She didn't know how. But that night, when he left a warm bowl of soup on the nightstand, she sat up and ate. The next morning, she opened the curtains. And by sunset, when Miles knocked with another drawing, she opened the door. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't a miracle. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, that's more than enough. 3 steps and a miracle. The light of early morning spilled across the worn wooden floorboards of the Willow Glen Inn, painting everything it touched in soft gold. Outside, dew clung to the wild grass and sunlight filtered through the branches of the willow tree like gentle fingers tracing an old memory. In the hush of that new day, the world held its breath. Inside, Amelia Hart sat in her wheelchair near the edge of the porch, a thick sweater draped around her shoulders and a steaming mug of tea nestled in her palms. She had been there for almost an hour, watching the shadows shift across the garden path. Her eyes followed the stones Miles had laid out the day before, flat, smooth ones he had collected and placed in a line leading to the willow tree. Her dance path, he called it, from the porch to the tree. 3 steps. That was all she wanted. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she could still feel it, the pull of music through her limbs, the quiet anticipation before the curtain rose. The stage had once been her sanctuary. Movement had been her first language. But the accident changed all that. In its place came silence, stillness, and a slow mourning for the person she used to be. But something had shifted in her since arriving here. Since that impossible, imperfect day on the church steps. Since the boy with 2 big eyes and an even bigger heart looked at her and simply saw someone who needed love. The door creaked open behind her. "Mom," Miles whispered, using the word with effortless grace, as though it had always belonged to her. He stepped outside, barefoot and blinking against the sun, carrying a notebook and a crayon. "You ready?" Amelia looked down at her hands, then back at the path. "Maybe," she said, her voice quiet. "I think it's time to try." From inside, Caleb emerged. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He had been waiting for this moment not with pressure, but with presence. He walked over and placed his hand lightly on her shoulder. "I'm right here," he said. Amelia handed him the mug and reached slowly for the cane leaning beside her. The grip felt unfamiliar, even foreign. She drew in a long breath, bracing her core, steadying her resolve. Caleb moved to her side, not touching, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the steadiness. Miles stood ahead at the first stone, his notebook ready. Amelia rose. It was not graceful. Her legs trembled. Her breath came in sharp, shallow pulls. The pain wasn't sharp, but it was there, the dull ache of muscles long dormant, the stiffness of memory etched in a bone. But she stood, her spine straightened, her chin lifted. Step 1. The cane landed on the first stone with a soft tap. Her left foot moved, then her right. Caleb didn't move. He simply breathed with her. Step 2. The wind stirred through the garden, rustling the wildflowers. Somewhere nearby, a bird took flight. Miles scribbled something quickly in his notebook, then looked up, grinning. "You're almost there, Mom." Amelia wanted to cry, but there were no tears, only that deep, aching fullness that lives just beneath the ribs. She was almost there. Step 3. The third stone. The one beneath the willow. She stopped. Her breath caught. The tree, its long limbs swaying above her, had once been her favorite spot to rehearse, to think, to just be. And now she was there again. Not as the woman who could leap, twirl, and glide, but as the woman who had learned to stand. Miles ran to her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You did it," he cried. Amelia dropped the cane and knelt, or rather, let herself fall carefully to the ground, pulling Miles into her embrace. Her knees protested, her breath shook, but her heart soared. Caleb joined them, kneeling beside her in the grass. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped one arm around her back and the other around Miles. And they sat there, the 3 of them, under the canopy of the willow tree. No applause, no spotlight, just sunlight, grass, breath, and the quiet knowing that something sacred had just taken place. It wasn't about walking. It was about believing again, in her body, in her future, in love that didn't need to be grand to be true. Later that morning, as they returned to the porch, Miles turned to her. "Do you think tomorrow we could go all the way to the fence?" Amelia laughed through the tears still glistening in her eyes. "Maybe," she said, "but today 3 steps is more than enough." She looked at Caleb, who met her gaze with a quiet pride that made her feel steady again. 3 steps and a miracle," he whispered. And for the first time in years, Amelia believed it too. The morning after the vows, the willow tree still shimmered with dew when Amelia opened her eyes. The previous day lingered in the air like perfume, soft, fragrant, nearly unbelievable. She touched the silver ring on her finger, not out of disbelief, but wonder. It wasn't grand or heavy, just smooth and steady, like Caleb. The bed at Willow Glen creaked softly as she shifted. Caleb had woken earlier to take Miles on a morning walk, their quiet chatter now floating in through the open window like a familiar song. The kind that finds you, not the kind you chase. Outside, the garden had been gently cleared of ribbons and chairs, but the earth still held the shape of yesterday. A few petals remained beneath the willow, like confetti the wind refused to carry away. Amelia sat up and let her feet dangle for a moment, grounding herself in the stillness of this new beginning. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and strong coffee. She rolled into the room to find Joan, the innkeeper, humming while ladling batter onto a hot griddle. "Morning, Mrs. Morgan," Joan teased with a wink. Amelia flushed. "That is going to take some getting used to." "Well, you wear it well. There's something different about you today. Lighter." Amelia didn't argue, because Joan was right. Caleb and Miles returned not long after, cheeks flushed with the cool air and hands filled with wildflowers. Miles held one behind his back and dramatically presented it to Amelia. "For the bride," he said solemnly. She took it with a grin. "I'll treasure it forever." After breakfast, the three of them sat on the back porch with steaming mugs and silence that needed no filling. The kind of quiet only possible between people who had nothing left to prove. "Do you think," Amelia asked softly, "this will last?" Caleb looked at her, his gaze steady. "Not every day will feel like yesterday, but every day, I will choose you. That's what makes it last." Miles leaned his head on Amelia's shoulder. "Can we always have pancakes on the day after weddings?" She laughed. "Deal." That afternoon, they took a walk, Amelia using her cane, Caleb at her side, and Miles darting ahead like sunlight. They passed the church, now quiet, and the park bench where Caleb had first told her about the letters he never sent. They didn't talk much, but their fingers brushed often, like commas, not periods, marks of a story that wasn't ending, just breathing in a new chapter. Later, back at the inn, Miles disappeared into the garden. When they found him, he was rearranging stones into a heart around the base of the willow tree. "So people know this is where love grows," he explained. Amelia crouched beside him, tracing one of the smooth rocks with her fingertip, "and where it learns to stay." That evening, the sky wore its best colors, apricot and lavender. Caleb grilled vegetables while Amelia stirred lemonade, and Miles built a fort out of blankets and lawn chairs. After dinner, they sat in the fading light, shoulder to shoulder, the silence wrapped around them like a quilt. And Amelia knew this wasn't a wedding followed by real life. This was real life, wrapped in the grace of choosing each other again and again. She looked up at the tree, its branches swaying gently in the dusk. "Let's make this our always place," she whispered. Caleb reached for her hand. "It already is." And Miles, from his fort, declared, "Next year we do it again. With cake." Amelia laughed. "Only if you pick the flavor." "Peanut butter and marshmallow," he said proudly. Caleb groaned. "We may need a wedding planner." And under the willow, love stayed, not because it was perfect, but because it was present. Every single day, a studio with no mirrors. The old community center at the edge of Maple Hollow had once served as a bingo hall, then a quilting space, and for a time, a storage room full of forgotten folding chairs and broken lamps. But now, on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, the sun stretched through its wide windows, illuminating something entirely new. A place where feet didn't matter as much as hearts did. Amelia Hart wheeled herself into the center of the room, a warm hum of quiet conversation rising around her. Her studio had no mirrors. That was intentional. She didn't want her students to see what they looked like while dancing. She wanted them to feel it. Bright streamers of fabric hung from the ceiling. Yoga mats were scattered in a wide semicircle, each paired with a colorful scarf and a small wooden block. Amelia had arranged it all herself, with some help from Caleb and a very enthusiastic Miles, who had insisted on naming the studio the Brave Room. "Because it takes bravery to move when you think you can't," he explained with 8-year-old certainty. Her first students arrived shyly. A girl in a pink wheelchair with curly brown hair and eyes too tired for her age. A boy with leg braces who wouldn't look anyone in the eye. An older woman recovering from a stroke, her daughter guiding her gently by the elbow. Amelia greeted each of them with the same quiet warmth. "You're not here to be perfect," she told them. "You're here to be present." The class began slowly, breathing, swaying, movements guided not by strict form, but by story. Amelia asked them to imagine wind in their fingertips, sunlight on their cheeks. Music played, soft, wordless melodies, as bodies moved not in unison, but in shared courage. When the boy in braces stumbled, Amelia smiled and said, "That was the bravest step in the room." When the girl in the wheelchair lifted her arms in time with the music, Amelia whispered, "There it is, the dance that comes from who you are, not what you can do." Week after week, the room grew brighter, not from sunlight, but from the light that comes when someone dares to move through pain, through fear, through doubt. Caleb often brought warm muffins during breaks, and Miles was everyone's biggest cheerleader, handing out tiny bravery badges made of paper and glitter. No one asked why Amelia didn't dance with her legs. They didn't need to. Her presence, the grace in her arms, the command in her voice, it was enough. One afternoon, the woman recovering from a stroke took 3 uneven steps across the room. Her daughter clapped and cried. Amelia reached out and steadied her, eyes shining. "That," she said, "is a miracle in motion." After class, as Amelia packed up scarves and folded mats, a teenager lingered by the door. She wore long sleeves, even in the heat, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I used to dance before I got sick," she said. "Now I just watch." Amelia looked at her, really looked. Then she smiled. "You watched yourself dance today. That counts. And next week, maybe you move. Maybe just a finger, or an elbow, or your heart. Whatever shows up, we'll dance with it." And the girl nodded. Later that evening, as Caleb helped her into the porch swing and Miles snuggled beside them with a comic book, Amelia looked out over the garden and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Useful, not in the old way, where her value had been measured by her ability to leap or teach perfect pirouettes, but in a new way, a way that embraced every tremble, every pause, every small act of courage. She hadn't returned to dance. She had rewritten it. And now, the studio with no mirrors reflected more truth than any ballroom she had ever known. The second wedding and the first dance. The sun filtered through the leaves of the old willow tree, casting dappled shadows on the garden lawn where the chairs had been set up. White lanterns swung gently in the late spring breeze, their soft glow mimicking fireflies. The scent of lavender and lemon cake hung in the air, woven with laughter, violin notes, and the quiet murmur of neighbors greeting neighbors. Amelia Hart stood at the edge of it all, her hand resting on the arm of her wheelchair, her eyes scanning the scene she never thought she'd live to see. She wasn't wearing white this time. Her dress was the color of sunset, burnt rose and dusky gold. Not a color for a bride, but a color for a woman who had risen, fallen, and risen again. Caleb Morgan approached from the other end of the yard, his son Miles trailing behind, trying not to trip over a too long tie and grinning at every guest who greeted him as the unofficial wedding captain. They didn't need this wedding. Not after the one under the willow tree a year ago. The one with cocoa instead of champagne, vows written in Miles's scrawl, and a kiss that tasted of quiet promises. But today wasn't about what they needed. It was about what they had earned. A day to celebrate not a beginning, but a becoming. When Amelia wheeled herself down the grass aisle, no one stood in polite formality. Instead, they leaned forward. Some clutched tissues. Others simply smiled like they were watching the sunrise. Caleb met her halfway. "I still can't believe you agreed to do this again," she said softly, her voice edged with a grin. "I didn't ask," he said, offering his hand. "Miles did." She glanced to the side where Miles was busy directing flower girls. He caught her eye and gave a double thumbs up. "I couldn't say no to him," she whispered. "No one can," Caleb agreed. Their ceremony wasn't led by a pastor or judge. Instead, neighbors read lines from books they loved. Lines about courage, kindness, persistence. Maggie, Amelia's friend from the studio, read a quote about dancing through storms. Pastor Ellis, retired and soft-spoken, closed with a quiet prayer that thanked not for a perfect life, but for the power of presence. Then came a dance. Amelia didn't stand. She didn't need to. The music swelled around them. A gentle waltz played by the local string quartet, and Caleb stepped close. He knelt slightly, rested his hands on hers, and together they moved. Not across a floor, not in a grand ballroom, but there, on the grass, under the willow tree. They swayed with the music. Amelia's arms moved with grace that came from within, not from training or technique. Caleb followed her rhythm, not with his feet, but with his breath. People watched in silence, some holding their breath. Not because they feared she'd fall, but because they realized she already had, many times, and she'd always gotten back up. This wasn't just a first dance. It was a resurrection. Afterward, Miles bounded up with a clipboard. "I have announcements," he declared, face flushed. Number 1. The cake is chocolate and has no nuts, so Miss Eleanor can have some. Number 2. There's a piñata shaped like a heart, because I thought it should be. And number 3. He paused dramatically, flipping to his second page. Today, my mom and dad danced even though the world once said they wouldn't. So that means anything is possible. Even dancing with ducks. Laughter erupted, and Amelia pulled Miles close. "Where did you get your bravery?" she asked. "From watching you," he whispered. That night, when the stars shimmered above and the last lantern swayed in the trees, Amelia and Caleb sat beside each other on the porch swing of the inn. The guests had left. The music had faded. Only Miles remained awake, chasing fireflies with a mason jar. "I was afraid," Amelia said. "Even this morning. I thought, what if I can't move the same way? What if I don't look like I used to?" "You don't," Caleb said. "You look stronger." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not for loving me, but for waiting while I learned to love myself again." "You taught me how to stay," he replied. Across the yard, Miles held up the jar with one lone firefly inside. He waved to them. "Look, it's still glowing." Amelia smiled. "So am I," she said. And under the willow tree, where vows had once been whispered, and again where music rose for a second first dance, a woman who thought her story had ended discovered the most sacred truth of all. Healing isn't a return. It's a becoming. And love, real love, doesn't wait for perfection. It waits for honesty. And then it dances. A lesson in falling forward. The sun filtered gently through the old lace curtains in the living room, casting long stripes of gold across the worn wooden floor. Amelia sat on the edge of the couch, her cane leaning against the coffee table, one hand pressed to her lap, as if grounding herself. The morning air held a crispness that hinted autumn was beginning its quiet descent, though the calendar hadn't yet caught up. Caleb was in the kitchen making French toast, humming a tune Amelia couldn't quite name, but knew by heart. Miles sat cross-legged nearby, working diligently on a craft project involving popsicle sticks, glitter glue, and what looked suspiciously like Amelia's best pair of knitting needles. "Mom," Miles said without looking up, "do you think we can add lights to the dance path?" Amelia smiled faintly. The dance path. What had started as a spontaneous line of smooth stones laid by Miles along the backyard grass had become something more. A ritual, a rhythm, a declaration. Every day, Amelia walked the path. Sometimes 2 steps, sometimes 12. Some days with confidence, others with silent tears. But every time she walked it, and every time, Miles was there, not cheering loudly, but waiting at the end like a lighthouse keeper. "Lights would be lovely," Amelia said softly. "Then it'll shine at night too," Miles said, "because brave things should be seen even when it's dark." She blinked, looking away toward the garden beyond the window. After breakfast, Caleb helped her outside. The breeze was gentle, stirring the edges of the quilt Amelia had draped over her lap. Miles ran ahead, already planting small battery-powered fairy lights along the edge of the stones. "Watch your fingers," Caleb called. "They're insured," Miles quipped, and Amelia laughed. Each laugh, each step, each sigh had become a kind of dance. Not the grand, sweeping movements Amelia once taught in studios full of mirrors, but the kind measured in inches and courage. "Want to try today?" Caleb asked, offering his arm. She nodded. They began at the start of the path. Amelia adjusted her grip on the cane. Her legs trembled, but her back stayed straight. One step, Then another. Caleb kept close, but didn't guide. He knew now that her strength didn't need permission, only presence. At the halfway point, a bird chirped from the willow. That's the same bird that always sings when you walk, Miles whispered. I think it's rooting for you. Amelia smiled. Then I better not disappoint it. She made it to the end. And then, on impulse, she turned and walked back. The wind picked up. One of the fairy lights blinked. Halfway through the return, her foot caught. She stumbled. Caleb reached out, but she waved him off. Let me fall, she said, breathless. He froze. She did fall, but slowly, deliberately lowering herself until she was sitting in the grass, not crumpled but placed. Miles ran over, panic in his face. I'm okay, she said quickly. He stopped. Why'd you let yourself fall? Amelia looked up at both of them. Because falling isn't failure, she said. Not when it's part of the dance. They sat with her. Caleb cross-legged. Miles, resting his head on her shoulder. You scared me, Miles murmured. I know, sweetheart. But sometimes we have to let the ground catch us so we can rise again stronger. He was quiet, absorbing it like he did everything else, slowly, deeply. So, Miles said, sitting up straighter, do you want me to write in the journal today? Amelia tilted her head. What would you write? Miles pulled a small notebook from his hoodie pocket. The pages were crinkled, the edges smudged with time and hot chocolate fingerprints. He opened to a blank page and, after a long pause, began to write out loud. Today, Mom fell on purpose. Not because she gave up, but because she knew she could get back up. That means her legs are learning more than steps. They're learning trust. Caleb exhaled quietly. Amelia reached for Miles' hand. That was perfect. It's true, he said simply. Later, after warm baths and mugs of chamomile tea, Amelia sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl. The dance path glowed with tiny fairy lights, a soft constellation on the earth. You know, she said to Caleb, I used to think strength was standing tall no matter what. He glanced at her. Now I think strength is being willing to kneel, to fall, to rest, and still believe in standing again. He leaned in, kissed her temple. You're the bravest dancer I know. The porch was quiet then, except for the sound of the wind and the creak of wood beneath them. In the darkness, the dance path shimmered, a silent promise that tomorrow she would walk it again. The studio of second chances. The opening day of the Still Dance studio dawned with the kind of hopeful quiet only small towns know how to keep. Pinebrook hadn't seen many new storefronts over the years, and fewer still with hand-painted signage bearing words like healing and hope. But there it was, etched in soft gold across the glass door, for those who thought their story ended. Inside, Amelia Morgan, once heart, stood in the center of the studio, her palms gently pressed together, breath steady, eyes misted not with nerves but with the weight of what this place meant. The floors gleamed under the morning light, polished not to perfection, but to honesty. There were no mirrors on the walls. Not one. Only windows that let light in and let the world see out. She had chosen it that way on purpose. Because this wasn't a studio for perfection. It was a sanctuary for second chances. The first students arrived just after 10. A small group of children and a few adults, some in wheelchairs, some with braces or walkers, one with a prosthetic leg and a shy smile. Their eyes flickered around the space with tentative curiosity, unsure whether they belonged. Amelia met each one at the door, offering a warm greeting, a gentle handshake, or a hand placed over a heart. She didn't look past their differences. She looked into them. Welcome, she said, to each one. This is your space now. Caleb watched from the reception desk, temporarily repurposed from an old library checkout counter, with pride swelling in his chest. He'd seen Amelia rebuild herself from the ground up, not with the urgency of a comeback, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had learned the value of staying. Miles bounced beside him, his notebook already half filled with sketches of the studio. He'd drawn Amelia beneath the words on the window, her arms raised in a silent dance of belonging. It's going to be great, he said, matter of fact, as if he could already see the future unfolding like the pages of a sketchbook. The first class began with music, not classical ballet or structured waltzes, but the sound of wind chimes and soft acoustic guitar. Amelia moved to the front, not standing but seated, her wheelchair position where she could see every face. "Before we move," she said, her voice calm and sure, "we breathe." And so they did. A room of people inhaled together, different ages, shapes, stories, and exhaled like leaves let go in the autumn wind. It was awkward at first. Shoulders shrugged, breath staggered. But Amelia smiled, unbothered. "Good," she said. Now again, movement came slowly. Arms lifted, fingers fluttered, chests open like morning blooms. No one was asked to stretch further than they could, or to mirror someone else's grace. They moved how they could, with what they had. And Amelia? She moved with them, not as a teacher who once danced better, but as a guide who danced deeper now. Every gesture she gave was a gift, an invitation, not a command. By the end of class, something had shifted, not just in posture, but in presence. One girl, maybe 10 years old, wheeled herself up and whispered, "I thought I had to stop dancing after the surgery." Amelia leaned in, but didn't stop. "You," paused, "and look, you're moving again." The girl blinked, then smiled. And just like that, a heart opened. Outside, the sky had clouded over, but inside the studio, the light held firm. The students trickled out slowly, some chatting, some silent. But each one walked, or wheeled, away straighter than they had come. That night, after Miles had gone to bed and the dishes were drying on the rack, Amelia sat across from Caleb at their small kitchen table, her tea cooling in her hands. "I was so scared," she admitted. "Starting it. What if no one showed up? What if I failed again?" Caleb reached across and covered her hand. "But you didn't fail. You showed up. That's the hardest part." She nodded, then looked toward the window where the lights of the studio still softly glowed. "I don't want to be seen as brave," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to be real." "You are," Caleb replied. "And that's why people keep coming." In the weeks that followed, the Still Dance studio became more than a class. It became a community. Parents who had given up on dreams of recitals watched their children spin with joy. Elderly women danced seated in circles, sharing stories through sways and rhythms. Teenagers with guarded hearts found peace in music that didn't ask them to be anything but present. And Amelia? She danced too, not always with movement, but with presence, with compassion, with the quiet knowing that sometimes the most powerful steps are the ones you take when no one's watching. One afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, just a note in slanted handwriting. "I came by the studio today. I didn't have the courage to walk in, but I watched through the window. You looked alive. Thank you for not giving up. I think maybe I won't give up either." Amelia pressed the paper to her chest, breath catching. Then she placed it in the small wooden box labeled, "Proof of Light." Because healing didn't need loud applause. It only needed one person who chose to try again. And Amelia had chosen, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever wondered if they still could. In today's fast-paced and often indifferent world, the story of Amelia, Caleb, and young Miles becomes a mirror, not one that reflects perfection, but one that gently reminds us. Healing begins in the smallest of ways. A cup of coffee handed with care, a glance without judgment, a step shaky but determined. These seemingly ordinary gestures are the threads that weave quiet miracles. Not the kind made on grand stages, but the kind that rise from compassion and the simple act of staying. In real life, many around us are living as Amelia once did, in silence, in the shadow of who they used to be, what they once had, or what they once dreamed of. They might be the older woman at the end of the block who used to teach but now lives alone. The single father juggling 2 jobs. The quiet teen in class who avoids eye contact. Amelia's story reminds us that a kind question, a patient presence, a well-timed hug, these things might not change the world, but they might just change someone's world. The most powerful lesson from the story isn't that Amelia walked again, but that she chose to keep moving, despite pain, fear, and limits she hadn't yet overcome. She didn't wait until she felt ready to live. She lived so that, day by day, she could become ready. She didn't wait to be loved. She chose to be seen. Seen by a child, by a man who promised nothing but presence, and by a community who embraced her for who she was, not who she used to be. And if there's something we can all take from this, it's that you don't need to be perfect to be worthy of love. You just need to be real, trying, showing up, refusing to give up. Because sometimes the most beautiful thing you can do for the world is to believe you still matter and to be brave enough to share yourself. In a time when so many feel invisible in a crowd, be someone like Miles, the boy who pointed to a quiet woman in a wedding dress and said, "She looks like someone who needs us." And if you're brave enough to stay, to love even without guarantees, you just might be the miracle someone's been quietly praying for. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the heartland of America, a quiet countryside, or maybe a bustling city dreaming of open fields? Drop a comment. Below, I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of warmth in your day, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting story like this. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.